Excellent presentation, Geeta. I think this has been excellent presentation. I think on your last point, Geeta, we'll open up the questions. I'm taking the name still. We have Ambedkar also looks at Buddhism in a very emancipatory and liberatory way, because every time he talks about parliamentary democracy, he's talking about communism, because Buddhism very much intersects with his utopian, if you will, dream of thinking of possibilities. And he's like, guys, we are not alien to these concepts. We already had this. Don't you shy. We have already been exercising it evidently, and we have had the best system. So I think that's the kind of Buddhist focus that continues to come into focus. And I have seen his one comment on Constitution again in one of the things where he is actually, I have written it down here, where he says, I am quite prepared to join that body of people who want to abolish the Constitution at any rate, to redraft it. But then he goes on about, we have Constitution which contains legal provisions, and it's only a skeleton. The flesh is what we call constitutional morality. So again, he's still skeptic. 1952, freshly given Constitution. He's like, I'm ready to join. People are saying, let's abolish Constitution and all. But he's like, wait. This is just a pro forma. This is a skeleton I provided. So I think we have a lot of things that we can talk through the constitutional questions that we have, but also importantly, the question of labor and working class leadership that we have seen. Shahjanand Swami, something I would like to uplift that voice very effectively. So Sujata, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Geeta. Thank you, Suraj, and thank you for AKC. I had a quick question when you were talking about Gokhale and Dadabhai Naoroji, and also the earlier socialistic ideas that were coming in. And I'm wondering, where was the blind spot, or how could there be such a glaring blind spot in the context of India, where labor is caste and caste is labor, and how would, without including caste, what was their imagination of socialism around a laboring society?
That would take me another 45 minutes, Sujata, but in any case, very, very briefly, I think the early economists, in fact, Ranade and Gokhale were far more aware of caste than the classic Indian left was. And I think they understood that caste informed the peasant economy. Only thing, they couldn't connect economics and politics in the way that Ambedkar would do later on. They felt caste could be addressed on the social plane first, and then economic stuff can be handled through legislation. So that was their point of view. I think the Indian left is a curious case. I think part of it is also because the way the Indian left emerges from within specific sites, like the Bombay working class organizing site, the Kolkata working class, and in Kanpur and so on. And Kanpur is interesting because the strength of the unions there are actually to do with sanitary labor and the leather workers. So how could they not have seen caste as central there is something very interesting. But as I said, one has to differentiate communist organizing from communist argument. Communist organizing did take on caste, had to take on caste, had to deal with caste in an everyday sense. But when they wrote up their sense of what needed to be done to push communist politics, they relegated caste to a feudal past, which past they felt was already retreating and taken over by capitalist past. And once capitalism sort of gets in place, then you will have caste disappearing, and then we can sort of all come into socialism. So this was a classic mechanistic understanding of social and economic change, which they inherited from their mentors in the Communist Party of Great Britain and in the Soviet Union, especially after the 1930s. And they didn't really follow their own practice and theorize from their practice. So Dr. Balagopal put it very well. He said when Lenin wrote of the Russian peasantry, he started from the Russian conditions, but we start from Lenin. So that's what we did, and that's where we still continue to have a problem.
Excellent answer. Thank you so much. Geeta, you just said the Indian left emerged from organizing of, you gave locations, right? Could you maybe just highlight that one more time? Kanpur, I remember you said.
No, I said the trade union cultures, Kanpur, Bombay, Chennai, and Kolkata.
Right.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is two important questions. Why the communist parties can be successful in India? And another question is, In what reason does Anand Teltumde is important for Ambedkarite as well as communists too?
Okay. The communist movement, I think, has been a victim of its own theoretical models. But in practice, in terms of what it achieved in different parts of India, is not something we need to slight or consider only negatively. But I think if communism has to stay relevant, not just in India, across the world, it obviously has to rethink its own past and reflect on its histories and be prepared to unlearn a lot of things. And I think one of the golden opportunities provided for a resuscitation of communism as a political alternative comes from the anti-caste movements. And there's just so much available today by way of what has been said and done in these movements that it's a great opportunity to assimilate this knowledge and work along with the histories of these movements to rethink communism for India. Now, whether it will be communism in the classic sense, what would you call it? This is something we can always come back to. But I think that the future really depends on how we rethink some of these issues. And the coronavirus has provided us with yet another opportunity, because you see very definitely that the state has a role to play. But what kind of a state is it going to be? A state which does not believe in liberty, a state which does not understand socio-economic inequality. And I think there's a lot of stirring going on amongst us today, and hopefully we can bring some of these issues together even in these very dark moments. And I think Anand Teltumde's work has gestured towards the possibility of a conversation between the anti-caste movements and the left. And his writings, more than his stated positions, offer us ways of thinking through this conundrum, whether it's on Keralanji, on Mahad, or the essays that are there in the Republic of Caste. Anand Teltumde sometimes comes out as being extremely partisan and in favor of this or that position. But I think he's pushing us to take certain positions. But his actual writings unpack these questions in very, very complex ways. And I would urge everybody to go back and read his writings over a period of time. And of course, critically engage with him, argue with him. But there's still a lot there we haven't fully unpacked.
Right. I think on that point of that partisan kind of standing, which is very much, ideologically robust and at sometimes confining, I think that's an open call.
Hi. Yeah, so a comment on the question. So when we say that Russian Communist Party believed in the armed insurrection, I think that is not the case from the beginning. Even immediately after Marx, if there is an electoral path where the communist parties got elected, they are perfectly okay with it. But the point is, I think, I feel maybe right or wrong, all of us are thinking, and you also talking like the bourgeois as a class are very benevolent, and when the working class will elect their representatives, they will let them to come to power. That will not happen, and that has not happened in the history also. Because the good example is Chile. When Chile, Salvador Allende is elected, that he thought the same illusion he had, that they will be allowed to rule, and where the Fidel Castro gave him automatic rifle, and at least to keep it for your defense, and it was toppled. And there was no capitalist countries condemned it. And also, when Lenin's insurrection took place, Lenin was very clear. The insurrection will be successful because of the advanced section of the working class are with them. It is not because of the party, it is not because of the arms. And also, the people died is not because of the revolution, which is very less, but only because of the civil war they died. And Lenin converted the bourgeois democratic revolution, which took place in the March 1917. Immediately in the October Revolution, it changed to the Socialist Revolution, where we theorized as there is no Chinese wall between the democracy and socialism. So that is a theory. And also, I think when we say the working class, there was a lot of general strikes were going between March and October, but it is not as a crisis, but Lenin theorized it is an inter-imperialistic war, and which has to be turned as a civil war. And that is understanding. You need not very dogmatically white the capitalism will go into the crisis and it will come to the power. And throughout the talk, we centered on Ambedkar, but as a bourgeois, as a class, one is the dictatorship of the bourgeois that we are living in. If the working class does not have that conscience of the bourgeois dictatorship, which is currently in place, then we cannot discuss the dictatorship of the proletariat. So my understanding is that we have to understand the current political democracy, that what we are in a political system is a bourgeois dictatorship. So can you address that, whether it is a bourgeois dictatorship or it is a bourgeois liberal political system that we are in?
See, I think we have to differentiate between the time period I am talking about and the time period we are in now. As a historian, I would insist on that difference. And while I broadly agree with your understanding of what happened in Soviet Union, I have lots of minor caveats which I don't wish to get into. But the point is that once the Soviet state was formed, especially after Lenin's death, the more mechanistic model of revolution was what was offered as a blueprint to the communist parties of the world, especially after the 5th and 6th Comintern Congresses. And the Communist Party of India, when it emerged in the late 1920s and after, was guided at every step by Comintern developments. And within just 2 years, they would move from having to endorse Indian nationalism as progressive to considering Indian nationalism as bourgeois. So I think the future of socialism being tied up with the future of the Soviet state became the means through which all countries in the world were expected to sort of do their political duty. And that had enormous consequences for the future development of communism in different parts of the world. And that's something you see happening in India, the kind of somersaults that the communists have to undergo between, say, 1927 and 1936, where they shift 4 different positions when the outside environment hasn't changed all that much. So I don't want to get into that argument, but basically to say that the world communist movement did not make it easy for Indians to theorize their situation on their own. And they were trammeled by the Communist Party of Great Britain, who was put on them as a supervisory body. And this is something that's historically provable. That's one thing. Now, of course, whether through electoral means the workers will be allowed to sort of become part of a parliament and eventually capture power, I don't think Ambedkar sees that as a solution in terms of it possibly happening or that it could happen and achieve something. He was far more aware than we are today about the very fragile nature of parliamentary democracy. And all his later day writings, and Suraj started with some of those, point to the fact that parliamentary democracy is not going to endure, that it will come up against private property and the law of contract, and therefore economic democracy is important. Now, how does one get there, whether it is through insurrectionary means or through the democratic means or a combination of the two? He's still thinking aloud. The verdict is still out as to what may be done to actually capture power. Now, as to what has happened today, that's a very different development, and we have to go through the entire period of post-independent India to understand the precise nature of the Indian state today. And I think that I would still be careful even with being dismissive of something like bourgeois democracy, because you see that it is exactly the absence of any sort of protocols to do with bourgeois democracy in the Indian context over the last 20 years that has landed us where we are, that we cannot even expect the formal letter of the law to be honored, the formal constitutional spirit to be honored. You have scant respect for constitutional morality in this country. To that extent, we never really had even bourgeois democracy to speak with, especially over the last 25 or 30 years. And let's not minimize the impact of what such a democracy could do in a country like India. These are large debates. I don't want to get into any of them. But I do feel this polarization of bourgeois and socialism is something we may need to revisit and ask ourselves about the role of the state in modern times. What has the state done? Who has been directing the state? Can the state, in spite of itself, be made to yield certain kinds of social goods? Why would it do that? Because these are all consequential questions in an everyday sense. If a state does not endorse reservation, and any kind of state in India until now has endorsed reservations, any kind of government in India, then the consequences are going to be immense in India. Now, reservations is not a revolutionary policy, but the consequences will be dramatic and traumatic for India if that didn't exist. So I think we need to really rethink some of these terms of analysis as well, without giving up a rigorous understanding of the economy and a rigorous critique of capitalism, but perhaps also draw on new ways of thinking. So I leave you with that for now.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, ma'am. Thanks for your time. I have a question. What is the reason few of the Marxist or communist sometimes does some critiques on Ambedkar? One such example is recently there was a book released from Tamil Nadu, Chennai especially, I think. So there was a book released worth of 700 pages about Ambedkar, and his critics. So at what point they don't join, like Ambedkarites and Marx?
See, that particular book is not a Tamil book. It's a translation from Telugu. And a small communist group in Telugu had released that book in Telugu in 2001. And it was released in Tamil Nadu by us some 2 years ago, I think. I don't know if that book can be taken as a measure to understand the dialogue or lack of dialogue between the left and the Ambedkarite movement. I would more profitably start with Anand's own writings, Anand Teltumde's own writings, which are far more grounded in the realities of Indian economics and politics, and in the reality of the caste system. That is a book that remains within a fairly mechanistic understanding of Indian history, of socialism, and which sort of pulls apart writings and extracts from Ambedkar's very complex thought world to reaffirm certain communist dogmas. So for me, it's not even an interesting book to start with in terms of trying to understand what kinds of conversations we could have between Ambedkarism and Marxism. But why do such books get written? But I think you will also notice that there's a lot of theoretical noise, but very little practical action on the part of any of these groups that have put forth these pamphlets and these arguments. And where there has been a mass movement, where there have been movements, there have been occasions for rethinking this relationship. For example, if you read Anuradha Gandhi's writings, you see a far more complex engagement with caste and gender from within a broad left perspective than you would find in these kinds of pamphlets or 700-page pamphlets, because basically that's what they are. So I think we need to look far beyond the text that comes in a book to look at the actual political practice of groups to see what we can learn from them.
To that point, I'd met somebody, a Dalit activist, student activist from Telangana, who we told in their training camps was a communist a student union leader. They talked Ambedkar as a bourgeois democratic leader who is not fit for revolution, and that's how the Dalits were made, students were made, or the youngsters were made to think about Ambedkar as someone who is irrelevant to the revolutionary thinking. The question is written down. I will read out loud. Communists were into organizing rural laborers on wage issues, and also over many ancillary issues relating to dignity. Was Ambedkar involved in any of these kinds of movements?
I think we still have a lot that we don't know about the ILP, and the scholarship on the ILP is growing now. And Sanjay Suratkar's work has pointed to what Ambedkarite groups were doing by way of organizing in certain parts of Maharashtra at least. And I think struggles for dignity along with struggles for a better and more economic and just ways of existing were very much on the agenda of the ILP during the brief periods of its existence. And the fact that Ambedkar was willing to sort of rethink his own struggle against caste within the broader peasant question, which is what he meant to do when he extended a hand to Sajanand, tells us that he might have rethought that project in ways that we cannot anticipate now, had that historical coming together of the All India Kisan Sabha and the ILP taken place, because he was willing to go that extra mile to rethink his own positions about the annihilation of caste, and he had actually said that he will not foreground anti-untouchability struggles all the time entirely when there was a possibility of peasants and agricultural laborers coming together or the workers coming together. So he was not a dogmatist at all in that sense. But I do think that we need to know a lot more about the 1930s and especially the ILP before we can answer that question intelligently.
And I think there was a kind of question before this set of questions, and that is by the same person. How did Ambedkar relate to land reform and land redistribution movements? Did he consider access to land for Dalits as emancipatory, or did he think it was industrial labor which would be the real solution? I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. And Ambedkar, I think, took both positions. He did consider land for Dalits as very important for dignity, for self-sufficiency. This is something that he insists on from 1927, from Mahad onwards actually. And he's constantly looking out for land for Dalits. He's looking out for land in the Sindh. He's looking out for land in the regions that were going to be covered by the Damodar Valley project. And he's constantly wanting to feed the land hunger of the Dalits. How are we going to assign land to Dalits? He doesn't think that peasant revolutions will automatically result in Dalits getting land. That's his argument with the Telangana struggle. And we also know that Sundaraya himself admitted that it was not going to be easy. Now, where is this land going to come from? And that land is going to come from the village commons, or from what in Tamil Nadu you would call Porambok land, or the so-called wastelands. And he was very concerned that Dalits be left without land. Now, for him, land was not simply a means of sustenance. Land was also a marker of dignity, because those who possessed land were sort of granted a certain dignity within the peasant economy. And that was important for Ambedkar also, apart from the practicalities of having land. And land was also settlement. The fact that he didn't want Dalits to be part of the village social structure made him push for asking for separate settlements, home sites for Dalits to be in, so that they don't have to deal with caste Hindu violence. So I think he was moving from a normative sense of collective farms that everybody could labor on to a more immediate demand of settlements and land for Dalits as far as the land question was concerned. So he certainly didn't think that that industrial labor was the only option. But importantly, he was for land redistribution. In the Constituent Assembly, he makes it clear that that's an important part of what we should be doing. Of course, how do you do it? You give the zamindars proper compensation or you don't. These are all matters that he gets into. He even defends the zamindar in court on that ground, that you need to pay proper compensation if you're not going to be left with problems later on. And you will get into legal issues. So how does the state then work with those issues? So he was for land distribution on a fairly major scale. And let's not forget, land distribution at that time meant land for the peasants. Zamindari land was not going to go to the agricultural laborers. It was basically tenancy reform, right? So I think he did see that in a wide sense.
So could you maybe just explain the difference between peasant and agricultural laborers?
Yeah, so you have a system in India where you have the revenue rentier class, which stands above the actual cultivators. And those cultivators have access to land. Either they've held it for a long time, it's their land, so to speak, or they will hold it by rotation, as happens in different parts of India. Now, some of them hold it as tenants at will. So they have contracted with the rentier class to farm for a certain period, of which some proceeds will go to the rentier class and the state, and they will have some for themselves. So peasants can be tenant farmers, peasants can be individual landholders. They could have land, anything between, say, 3 acres to 800 acres. They're all peasants, and so to speak. Agricultural laborers can come from within the community of peasants, in that they would have very little land which cannot sustain them, and they will have to work on other people's lands. But agricultural laborers also comprise a large section of Dalits. I mean, almost all Dalits are agricultural laborers, in the sense they don't have land at all, except in certain parts of India, in certain parts of the United Provinces, in the Konkan, in Chengalpet district in Tamil Nadu. So they had access to land because they managed to acquire land after working abroad. And they had to hold that land with great difficulty. But 99% of Dalits were and continue to be agricultural laborers with no access to land.
Right. I think also for the peasants could also qualify, not necessarily Dalit caste. They could also be within the Shudra fold, which have greater access to, and which could also be like a loose definition of sharecropper. I think the same person asked Ambedkar's thought on land ceiling. Again, I think before we jump into that question, Ambedkar had proposed for a separate settlement, which was again an amazing idea, where he had actually even calculated how much the state government owned land is, which is unoccupied or ungrazed, and which could be then redistributed. And Ambedkar had done all this mathematics, I don't know for what reason, and he was all for compensation, fair compensation, which is very much contrary to what Lenin would do, which is without compensation. You took it away, we'll take it back, land and all, without compensation. So I think that's one thing. So Geeta, the question is Ambedkar on land ceiling. How would you look at it, or what was it?
The land ceiling as such was yet, I mean, let's not forget he passed away in 1956. And a lot of the legislation on land sealing, which is very much a state subject rather than a central subject, emerges thereafter in different parts of India. But in his understanding of the anti-zamindari legislation, he did, of course, support the restriction of land that any one person could hold. And the zamindari thing was exactly that you would redistribute the zamindar's lands and so on. So in to that extent, he would have certainly endorsed land sealing. Now, as to why he insisted on fair compensation to the zamindars is an interesting question. I think it is really the legalist in Ambedkar. He does really think you have to do this by law. And you're not doing this by revolution. Let's be very clear. You're doing this by law. You're a revolutionary movement and you're doing it. Perhaps you might not have said the same thing. But if it's going to come as constitutional mandate or constitutional fiat, you better adhere to the legal systems you've set up. I think he was disciplined enough to support something that he may not endorse personally. So
that's right. Even the Indian freedom movement was also not revolutionary in its plain sense. So I think the Indian kind of feel was not. We have another question. Can we take that, or we?
Yeah, we can. I'm okay as long as
it's so, or maybe it's a comment. Zamindari abolition ran into legal trouble at the very outset, and the first amendment of the constitution had to address it. Yeah.
Yes, of course. The zamindari abolition ran into legal trouble also because it was seen as an infringement of liberty, and just as the reservation policy was seen as an infringement on equality. In both cases, and the First Amendment had to be made. But I think historians have since showed us that the Congress party was not only going to be hurt by the Zamindari abolition bill. The Zamindars were not really sort of central to the kind of politics that Congress nationalists were going to advance after independence, and that the Zamindari abolition was a fairly safe measure to undertake, though immediate political interests in the United Provinces and in Bihar could be affected. But as far as the national government was concerned, Nehru's government was concerned, it was a promise that they had made themselves, and it was something that they were determined to see through. And to that extent, of course, it was a progressive measure. And the tension that emerged around the act was very much part of the kinds of politics that had emerged in the United Provinces at that time. So that's where I would leave that.